In terms of the operation, would you say it was successful?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. Look, a very successful operation. The US are calling it Operation Absolute Resolve, involving over 150 aircraft launched from clearly aircraft carriers, but over 20 bases, the US is saying. They took out clearly Venezuela's air defense capabilities as part of this. There's an interesting element where the US Joint Chiefs has said, General Kane has said that space and cyber were highly integrated. And there's talk about a blackout across Caracas. So there's some questions about whether they actually use cyber capability to take out the or parts of the electricity grid to make it easier for the US to get in, and that's really significant. This shows that modern warfare has fundamentally changed in terms of the integration of the space and the cyber domain. So a very successful campaign for the US for at least that tactical insertion.
And regarding the ramifications, it's mixed opinions that we're seeing, of course, and evolving as we speak. But what are you looking at in terms of the outlook?
Yeah, look, I think this is the key question. So, yes, a tactical success, but this has wide-ranging implications. The first of which, I guess, when we think about Venezuela, the president, Donald Trump, gave a press conference where he talked about the US ruling Venezuela. When you undertake military actions like this without a clear political outcome, it can become a bit of a quagmire. And we've seen that in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, we're not suggesting that Venezuela is anything like that, but there is a question about whether there is long-term thinking around what the US is trying to achieve here militarily. I think beyond that, yes, President Maduro was clearly a ruthless dictator. His human rights record, his record of complying with legal votes, the 2024 election, very clearly he was not actually lawfully elected. Despite that, though, there are real questions about what this means for international law. So really, under international law, you can only take an attack on another country if it's either endorsed by the UN Security Council, which this wasn't, or it's in self-defense. Now, that breaching of international law is part of a trend we're seeing where states are using military action or use of force across the world to achieve political aims. We've seen it, of course, in Europe in Russia's legal invasion of Ukraine. We've seen it in the Middle East. We've seen it between India and Pakistan, Thailand and Cambodia. And now we've seen the US do it in Venezuela. What this means is that really the world order in terms of international law is fundamentally breaking down. And there's a worry that this might encourage other countries to do the same. And of course, in the Indo-Pacific, there's a question about, does this encourage China to take further action against Taiwan? We saw that big exercise just a week ago, exercise justice mission. So I think that's a major concern. On the flip side, though, there is a question about whether this is actually re-establishing US deterrence. For the last decade or so, really ever since President Obama put down a red line in Syria and said that if the then leader of Syria used chemical weapons, that would be a red line for the US. The US didn't do anything after the leader did use chemical weapons. So there's been this question over the last decade about how much does US deterrence hold? And deterrence really rests on credibility, capability, and communications. And that credibility piece has been central. Now, I think that's one of the reasons Trump took action against Iran in June to re-establish deterrence. And there's a question about whether this action in Venezuela also does that, because it means that the US says they're going to do something and then they do it. And in some ways, that could be helpful for the Indo-Pacific and thinking about deterring China, but it could also be the flip side because of what it means for international law.
Yeah, very interesting indeed. And we had a former Navy SEAL on just before, Jennifer, and, you've made mention of Iraq, Afghanistan, but he also made mention that this particular situation is not ideologically driven, which was interesting to note when you compare what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, that's really true. And it doesn't actually look like, from what we're seeing anyway, that there's any US troops still on the ground there. So it is fundamentally different to those two. And the US reasons for doing this, look, they're not entirely clear. Of course, President Trump has talked about the narco-terrorist state that is Venezuela, and this is all about narco-terrorism. But we know that that's not really the case. Now, there's some commentary that it's about oil. I don't think it is just about oil. I think it is also about re-establishing deterrence and reducing the foothold of countries like Russia in the US's backyard. In fact, in the last 12 months, Venezuela signed a new strategic partnership with Russia, which is going to be really concerning to the US. So I agree. I don't think it's ideologically based. I think it's about a multitude of factors. I think oil's a part of it. I don't think drugs is part of it, but I do think deterrence is a key element of it.
All right, and then moving forward, what will you be looking out for in the next 24 to 48 hours?
Look, I think how the world reacts will be key. I think also how the US treats President Maduro. So they very much said that this is a law enforcement action. There's a question about US jurisdiction. But if they do it that way, and if he is charged and there is a legitimate trial as opposed to a show trial, that reestablishes some legitimacy for the US. But it will be interesting to see how countries like China, etc., react and what this means in the next 6 months for how they might take action against other areas or countries. And that's that. What does it mean for international law, and has that fundamentally broken down?
Yes, a lot to it, and certainly, unfolding as we speak. Jennifer Parker, always appreciate your time and analysis.
Thanks so much.